I was about 9 years old when a friend of the family told me about their own ghost story. Then now this would have happened to her when she herself was a kid. So if you can imagine about the 1950s, leaning into the 60s, and this would have been over in Chinkapin County, North Carolina. It was in the summertime, and she would go to visit her grandparents' farm, and it was about the time that she needed to go to bed. So she was laying down, and she recalls that the window was open to allow air circulation, and that's how she heard the sounds of a woman crying. Very distinct sounds of sobbing. So she got up, went to the window to look out and investigate. And the way she tells it is there was really nothing to see. It was just fields and darkness, and across the way she could see the neighbor's farmhouse. And judging that's where the sounds were coming from, but it was dark, all the lights were off, there was no signs of life, just these carrying sounds of a woman weeping and sobbing mournfully. Well, there was nothing that she could do about it, just being a kid, so she helped herself back to bed and eventually fell off to sleep. Well, it must have been the next morning, if you want to imagine, maybe they were over breakfast, and her grandmama would have asked her how she'd slept. And she had to be honest. It was a little disruptive, that woman in the night crying for no reason that she could understand. No woman that she could see. Just distant sounds of a woman crying. And it seemed to be coming from the neighbor's house. And that's when her grandmama explained to her the story behind that house. The way she told it used to be not too long before a young man lived there with his wife, and between them they had a baby. Unfortunately, the baby didn't make it, and the young wife never got over that. She cried so hard that she died of a broken heart. And it wasn't long after that that the man himself left the house. And the grandmama says that house has been sitting empty ever since. Ain't nobody lives there. And everybody knows from time to time you can hear the sounds of that woman's wailing in the dark of night. And there's naught that can be done about it.
One night, I played with a Ouija board with my friends. There were 5 of us, and we were talking to a spirit when 2 of my friends started walking around. They ran back to us and told us to run as fast as possible to my house. We did, but they didn't seem scared. I, on the other hand, was terrified, and I felt pain in my neck. The next day, we did another session and met Anne. She knew me and my friends, and she even knew my brother's dead name. She was nice, and we talked a lot, but suddenly she told us to run and hide. We listened, and she warned us to be quiet. The spirit we had invoked the previous night was actually a demon chasing us. She told us we were going to die if we didn't act fast, so we went back to the place from the night before. The board spelled out RUN and DANGER. We literally ran for our lives. Anne told us to continue the Ouija session in my room. She said we were safe there and began telling us things that only I knew about. I was too scared to continue, but my friends kept using the board at school. 2 or 3 months later, so just yesterday, we used the board again, and Anne was still there. After that session, we met another spirit, and she spelled out ZOZO. Apparently, that was a joke made up by Anne. The night after, I was lying in bed and glanced at the window. I saw a human face staring at me from the other side of the glass. I'm still scared, but I know what I saw was real. The story I wanted to share happened to my mom about 20 years ago. We lived in an upstairs apartment, just the 2 of us. During the short time we lived there, my mother's fiancé at the time took his own life in one of the spare rooms of the apartment. We didn't move out right away. likely due to financial reasons. My mom recently shared a story with me about an Easter morning during that time. She had been hearing footsteps in the middle of the night echoing down the hallway. At first, she thought it was me, but the footsteps were too loud and heavy to be those of a 5-year-old. She found it strange, but figured it might have been her imagination. The next morning was Easter. When my mother woke up, she saw me playing with my Easter basket toys in the living room. However, something seemed odd. The basket wasn't where she had placed it the night before. It was all the way in the corner of the room, resting on a small lamp table. She distinctly remembered leaving it in the middle of the room, on the coffee table. She asked me where I had found the basket that morning, and I told her it was on the lamp table. She also asked if I had moved it, but I told her I hadn't. To this day, she believes it was her fiancé's ghost, still lingering in our apartment after his death. I was so young at the time that I only vaguely remember that morning. I'm not sure if there's a logical explanation for it, or if it was truly something paranormal. One morning, I was in my kitchen prepping my morning coffee. I needed to grab something from my pantry and crossed the kitchen. I looked up and saw my mom walk out of her room and into the restroom. I searched quietly in my pantry because I knew if my mom heard me, she would come to the kitchen, and I just wanted her to sleep and rest since she had been taking care of my daughter. When I crossed the kitchen again, I saw the restroom door open and thought my mom had gone back to her room to change before coming to the kitchen. Even though I had been quiet in the pantry, I knew she had seen me because she looked my way. After a few minutes of being in the kitchen and my mom not showing up, I started getting nervous and thought maybe she wasn't feeling well. So I went to check on her. When I opened the door to her room, she turned around in bed, barely waking up, and asked, "What happened?" I nearly jumped out of my skin because she was just waking up, so I asked her if she had gone to the restroom. She replied, "No, I was asleep," and chills came over my body and tears filled my eyes. I told her, "Mom, I just saw you walk into the restroom. I saw you." I even waited, thinking you were going to come into the kitchen with me. She started getting chills too. By that point, she was wide awake, and I had turned the light on in her room. I remember her telling me, "I told you. I keep seeing things in the house and hearing things." The previous week, she had told me that she kept seeing something in the house and a strange light in our backyard. Back in the fall of 2017, I started my freshman year at Michigan State University. There is a trail behind some dorms, collectively called River Trail dorms, because of their proximity to the Red Cedar River in the woods. The trail is colloquially called Rape Trail because you enter it through a gap in a fence, and it can be known for some unsavory activity at night. I had never heard of any incidents there while I was there. Mainly, it was just where kids went to smoke. I had become friends with a couple of boys, and one day after dark, they decided to go to the trail to smoke, and I joined. I never smoked with them as I got obviously interrupted. The boys were doing their thing when a figure walked into the open gap in the gate. We were at least 50 feet from this gap, and the only people on the trail. It was probably close to 10 p.m., and besides the moon, the only lighting came from big parking lot lights close to the gate opening. At first, the boys I was with said that the figure resembled a Korean international student they knew. I had never met him, so I relaxed a little, thinking everything was fine and this person was a friend. They were calling out his name, but he never looked over at us and went off the trail path into the sticks and leaves without making a sound. They were still calling for him, and I was confused as to why he was acting so bizarre. I could sense the boys tensing up. This is the only way I can describe what happened next. The boy morphed into a very tall, at least 7 feet, completely pitch black, featureless, and clothless figure. It was human-shaped, extremely skinny, but reflected no light and seemed almost two-dimensional. The figure looked at us directly. Though it was maybe 50 feet away, it moved towards us effortlessly in about 2 strides as if it were floating. It came up to us almost head-on and still had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, all black. Then, when it was so close I could almost touch it, it morphed back into the international student, down to a probably 5'6" human male. The boys were extremely apprehensive and feigned normalcy, but were probably just trying to stay cool. They asked him questions, and he lit a cigarette, but I can't recall him speaking or answering anything, just smoking. We excused ourselves and pretty much ran back to our dorm. I was not the first person to speak. It was my friend who asked, "Did we just see Slender Man?" I said yes and suggested we not talk about it anymore. The other kid was speechless and said nothing. I've always been sensitive to energy, whether it be from the living or the dead. When my family moved into a new house in the early 1990s, I immediately knew there was something strange about it. Normal things would happen, like creakings, and seeing things out of the corner of my eye. But I never really liked the room I had been given. The room had belonged to the previous owner's adult son, who had painted or stenciled a huge black and white safari scene on the ceiling. The room was small, had double doors, and a large support beam running through it. I was always somewhat afraid to be in there by myself, so until I was about 11 years old, I slept in my sister's room. If I had to go into that room, I'd make it quick. I would get into trouble because instead of putting things away, I would open the door and toss something in the closet and close it again. If I was grounded, I would sit at the door and not really go far into the room. After a while, I began sleeping in that room on my own. One night I was making my bed, rearranging my stuffed animals. From out of nowhere, I heard a large, deep growl. I had no stuffed animals that made that kind of noise, so I just threw everything down and ran out and slept on the couch downstairs for a few nights. Sometime after that, I think it was when I was in the 8th grade, I had started sleeping in there every night. Most nights were uneventful, but sometimes I would hear scratching at the bed, carpet, and sometimes from the closet. At that time, my family had a gigantic American Akita, Yoshi. I would always invite Yoshi to sleep with me on nights like those. One night in particular was strange. I remember I was waking up and not able to move. I saw someone in my doorway and just assumed it was my sister. There was something strange about that person. She appeared to be all white. I couldn't tell if they had clothes on, because the body was mostly misty. And in the spot where there should have been eyes, there were just 2 black holes. It walked closer to me, and I was still unable to move. I tried screaming, but nothing came out. The last thing I recall was that it walked right up to me, and then I fell back to sleep. I told everyone about it the next day, completely unafraid of sounding crazy. Everyone told me I was just dreaming. About a year later, my friend Felicia spent the night at my house. There was supposed to be a meteor shower that night, so we had set the alarm for 4 a.m. to get up and watch it. She woke me up at 2 a.m., and although she was not afraid, she just kept repeating, "You were right. You were right." I asked her what had happened, and she said she woke up, and there was someone sitting in the middle of the floor. She assumed it was me, and asked me what the heck I was doing, but it wouldn't say anything to her. She then reached around and noticed I was still on the bed next to her. Then she turned back to look at the floor, and it had disappeared. I never saw her again after that. In another part of our house, there was a room that was like a loft that sat above the garage. It was connected to the rest of the house through a catwalk. It was always my favorite place to hang out because there was a TV, a DVD player, and computers up there. I would stay up almost until sunrise during the spring break and summers. And since I didn't like my room, I usually ended up sleeping on the couch. I kept this habit up until I graduated from high school, and I was about to leave for college. One day, my sister decided to watch a movie up there while I was away. She said she had fallen asleep during the movie, but awoke to her blanket being pulled off. She pulled back at it, but whatever was pulling it was stronger and pulled it completely off of her. She was pretty freaked out and never liked being in there again. Funny enough, though, she and her fiancé are now living in that part of my parents' house, as they save up money to move to another state. No further happenings have ever been reported from that part of the house. The house is pretty silent now. My father remodeled the whole thing, and I'm thinking that the spirits now understand that this is our house and it no longer belongs to them. But I still wonder if they'll greet me again next time I'm there. I moved to a fourplex in February with my roommate, and we both started experiencing some strange things. For example, we'd find the door locked, even though neither of us remembered locking it, and we'd wake up with handprints on our legs. Just little things like that, but still unsettling. A couple of months ago, the building burned down, and I had to move back in with my parents. Since then, whatever it was seems to have followed me, not my roommate, because the weird occurrences have continued. There's been classic paranormal stuff, like doors slamming, things turning on and off, and phantom footsteps. The door locking thing has been happening a lot too, and my mom has noticed it as well. But I've been dealing with most of it, probably because I'm home more often. I lost my job due to the fire. There are also moments where things are moved inside locked rooms, and no one remembers locking them. For instance, one time, a blanket was pulled off a made bed in a bedroom that had been locked from the inside with nobody in it. I'll admit that some of this might be due to lack of sleep. I haven't been sleeping well. But these things were happening even before that, and my mom's been experiencing them too. Some of it could theoretically be explained, I guess. We do have 3 dogs, but the most rambunctious one is with my dad at work most of the time. The other dog is old and lazy, and the third is tiny. There's no way they could replicate the sound of heavy footsteps. The household itself is pretty toxic. I moved out at 18 for a reason, so I'm constantly on edge. But I never experienced anything like this before I moved out, and my mom is noticing it too. We're the only 2 women in the house, and the ones home the most. One thing I'll add is that there was a murder-suicide in this house years ago, though we haven't felt anything particularly malicious. Back at the fourplex, it felt more like a protector. It would apparently harm men that stayed over, like my roommate's boyfriend. Though he's a good guy, or a couple of toxic people I had in my life, definitely not good guys. Now that I'm back in a home with so much negative energy, I wonder if it's reacting to that. When I was about 12, my family moved into an old house that had been empty for years. The first night, I heard soft footsteps outside my bedroom door, but when I opened it, no one was there. Over the next few weeks, the footsteps became more frequent, always stopping just outside my door. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering, low and unintelligible, coming from the corner of my room. When I turned on the light, I saw nothing, but the air felt heavy, like someone was watching me. The scariest moment came a few nights later. I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to move, with a crushing weight on my chest. In the darkness, I could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and shadowy, with no distinguishable features, just a dark presence. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The figure slowly leaned closer, and as it did, the temperature in the room dropped. Just as I felt it was about to touch me, the figure vanished, and I could move again. I never saw the figure after that night, but the fear of waking up to that presence still haunts me. Even now, I can't sleep in total darkness. I always keep a light on, just in case. My friend and I lived in a rented house in a city far from our hometown. We had rented it 2 years prior, and everything seemed fine in the beginning. However, after a few months, we began to get agitated over the smallest things, leading to ugly fights with each other, something that had never happened before. One night, while I was away, my friend was alone in the house. Around 2 or 3 a.m., he heard his mother calling his name from outside the house. He looked, but no one was there. He didn't mention the incident to me, so I remained unaware of these strange occurrences in the house. One day, While I was cooking in the kitchen, I suddenly felt the presence of a tall woman standing behind me. When I turned around, there was no one there. I dismissed it and continued cooking, but soon after, I heard knocking at the door. When I checked, there was nobody. Although I found it strange, I didn't consider anything paranormal at the time. After that, I began to have the unsettling feeling that someone was peeking through the window and watching me. For some context, we lived on the second floor, while the landlord and his family lived on the ground and first floors. There was a secondary terrace outside our apartment and a main terrace above us. I often heard footsteps on the secondary terrace, but whenever I looked, no one was there. One afternoon, I was alone in the house and trying to sleep. With my eyes shut, I struggled to rest. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw the same female figure I had sensed in the kitchen, hovering right above my face. In the blink of an eye, she vanished, and I felt her presence standing by the bedroom door, staring at me. When I shared my experience with my friend, he admitted that he had been having similar encounters. We decided it was time to move out, but every attempt we made was thwarted by strange circumstances. Once, we firmly decided on a new house, and the landlord there seemed very sweet at first. We moved in and began setting up, but by evening, the landlord suddenly became hostile and started fighting with us. We didn't know what had caused his behavior to change so drastically, but we had no choice but to leave immediately. Since it was late at night and we had nowhere else to go, we returned to the old house, despite everything that had happened there. After we moved back, the experiences intensified. What had been unsettling before became 10 times worse. We didn't know what to do. We were unable to move out, and yet staying in the house felt impossible. It drained all our energy, and we both began experiencing constant health issues. We owned a vacation home in Central Florida for several years. It was situated on a sizable lake, surrounded by several others, though not directly connected. A couple hundred years ago, the water levels were higher, so these lakes would have all been linked. Because of that, it made sense that Native American settlements existed in the area. It turns out that there was a fairly large village on the property, likely belonging to the Potano tribe. When the Spanish arrived in Florida, this village was one of those ravaged by disease. My son found several arrowheads and even a Spanish trading bee on the site. Over the years, we had many strange experiences that defy logical explanation. We would often hear people talking in the garage, and items would fly off shelves even though no one was near them. A few visitors, who didn't know anything about the history of the house, claimed they saw what looked like the face of a Native American man. One of the strangest occurrences involved a small patch of water that would appear in the middle of the bedroom floor. It was about the size and shape of an adult foot, and it never spread. There was no visible source for the water, and it didn't make sense that it would just appear from under the floor. It wasn't possible for someone to walk in with wet feet and leave just that one spot. To this day, we couldn't figure out where it came from or why it happened. In 1923, there was an 8-bedroom farmhouse that was owned by a fruit farmer named Joseph Scrimshaw. The house sat in a lonely area outside Gorefield, Cambridgeshire, England, with a broad ditch separating it from the roadway. It was at that time in 1923 that the owner, while living with his invalid 82-year-old mother and his 16-year-old daughter, began to have ongoing paranormal activity in their home. Mr. Scrimshaw explained some of this activity. About 11 p.m., his mother called out to him and said that her lace caps had been thrown from a nightstand and onto her bed. His daughter Olive slept in the same room, and she witnessed the caps flying around the room. While they were telling this to Mr. Scrimshaw, there was a loud crash in one of the unoccupied rooms. He rushed in and found that a washstand had fallen over. Then, a washstand in his own bedroom fell over. As soon as they picked them both up, they fell over again. Mr. Crimshaw went over to fetch a neighbor, and as they approached the house, they heard furniture falling. They scrambled inside and picked up the furniture, but soon it fell over again. The following day, Tuesday morning, there was a loud crash in the dining room. No one was in the dining room, and upon investigating the noise, they found a large table had fallen over, and one end of a piano in that room had moved about 2 feet from the wall. Later in the morning, there was a noise in Mr. Scrimshaw's bedroom. They went into the bedroom to find the washstand had been moved to the other side of the bedroom. That afternoon, a cupboard, a weather glass, and a filter were all found to have fallen, and by evening, a table and gramophone in the dining room fell, and the washstand in Mr. Scrimshaw's bedroom moved again, this time to the other side of the bed. In fact, that entire night, furniture was moved about within the house. On the following day, Wednesday, things were no different. In the morning, a clock fell off a nail, and the heavy marble clock fell off the mantelpiece. His daughter Olive and her grandmother were so upset that they stayed in their beds. But while Olive was lying on her back, books would be thrown from the table onto her bed. By the end of the day, Wednesday, all of the dishes and the glassware in the pantry were smashed. Other events included pictures and ornaments falling over, while the string holding the pictures was unbroken. 2 times that week, the piano fell over. A constable came by to help them put the piano back upright. Several people have come by to watch the house, but no one was able to see when something was thrown over. Whenever Olive and her grandmother were upstairs in the bed was when things were thrown about. One neighbor stayed the night and said that in the early morning hours there was a rumbling sound in one of the bedrooms like that of heavy furniture moving. And at that exact moment they heard Scrimshaw's daughter Olive utter a sharp cry. Olive, though, declared she never made a noise and slept soundly that night. News of the bizarre activity at the farmhouse piqued the interest of locals and eventually reached the ears of paranormal professionals and spiritualists. Paranormal investigators and spiritualists showed up to investigate the strange happenings. The investigators were astonished to see the broken dishes and furniture when they arrived. Once there, they held seances, kept all-night vigils, and questioned Mr. Scrimshaw, as well as his 82-year-old mother and his 16-year-old red-headed daughter, Olive. The Scrimshaws all told the investigators that the haunting events would stop for a while, but then would begin again and again. Both Mr. Scrimshaw and his daughter said they did not believe in ghosts. During a seance, as rain poured down on a February evening, spiritualists Hugh Racy, Henry Stimpson, and Mr. and Mrs. Taylor announced that there were several spirits in the home. One of them, a tall, dark man with very black hair, clean-shaven, and a ruddy complexion, who was wearing bandages around his head, was believed to be the spirit who was moving and destroying things in the home. The psychic, Mr. Lacey, added that this same spirit used to ride a coal-black mare horse, and that he was believed to be a man named Dick Turpin. One researcher said he believed the activity was related to the deaths of Mr. Scrimshaw's father 11 years prior, or perhaps to Mr. Scrimshaw's cousin who had passed 2 years ago. Mr. Scrimshaw told the press, "I had never had such a relative. I'm a churchman, and I don't take stock in ghosts and seances." As news of the farmhouse spread into the media, famous author and paranormal enthusiast Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the author of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a letter to Mr. Scrimshaw. He had some advice that included Mr. Scrimshaw send his daughter away from the home for a while, suggesting that his teenage daughter, Olive, may be an unconscious agent of forces from the psychic world.